April 27th, 2013. High on Mount Everest, 100 pissed off Sherpas surrounded a tent, trying to decide which of 3 European climbers they were going to kill first. Swiss climber Ueli Steck, Italian climber Simone Moreau, or British photographer Jonathan Griffith. Now, over 344 people have died on Mount Everest, but none of them have ever been murdered, at least not officially. However, on this day, murder was on the minds of everyone, especially the Sherpas. But that begs the question, why? I mean, what had these 3 European climbers done that was worthy of their lives being taken? And the truth is that they had done something that to most of us wouldn't seem like too big of a deal. Maybe a minor inconvenience to the Sherpas at most. But what may be seen in one culture as an inconvenience can have a totally different translation in another. You see, to these Nepalese Sherpas, what these European men had done was not only an insult, it was a grave sin. And so once this angry mob of Sherpas surrounded the men, all hell broke loose. Rocks and crampons were being thrown at their heads. Punches and kicks flew left and right. It was total mayhem unfolding in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. And even with one of the Europeans literally on his hands and knees begging for forgiveness, the chaos did not stop. Oh, and by the way, this is all before these folks even reached the actual death zone of Mount Everest. In this moment, in all of the chaos, there was only one person on Earth who had the skills, the relationships, and perhaps the temperament to stop this angry mob of Sherpas. Only one person could save the lives of these European climbers. And on this particular day, it just so happens that she was there at camp. Her name was Melissa Arnot, and she grew up on the outskirts of the Southern Ute Indian Reservation near Durango, Colorado. Now, at 12 years old, Melissa's family moved to Whitefish, Montana, which is a wealthy resort town outside of the famous Glacier National Park. However, I don't want you to get it twisted. Melissa's family was far from rich. They were, after all, service industry workers. And in case you don't believe me, at just 13 years old, Melissa found herself cleaning hotel bathrooms in order to earn extra money, which is like as far away from exploring nature as possible. The young Melissa would sew Nike logos onto her Payless shoes in order to try not to get made fun of by her wealthier peers. And that's just one example of the way that she grew up. However, Melissa would not let her peers keep her down. She graduated high school early and ended up moving out of her parents' house at age 16, starting life without a safety net, fully responsible for her own survival before she was even a legal adult. She ended up going to the University of Iowa and graduated with degrees in business, literature, and creative writing. Which means that if she ever sees this video, I hope she's not judging me too hard, and I hope she likes it. Oh, and by the way, if you like my videos, please consider helping us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, especially if you're a repeat viewer. If you look at our subscriber number right now, you're gonna see how close we are. I'm super excited, and if you're a new viewer, you don't have to subscribe now. I'm gonna do my best to earn your subscription by the end of this video. And so fresh out of college at 19 years old, which is crazy, and with no money to her name, Melissa lived out of her car with an abundance of free time for basically the first time in her life, and this is when she began climbing mountains. A friend had invited her to climb Great Northern Mountain in Montana, which by all accounts is a fairly non-technical climb. I've never done it, but from the research I saw, it doesn't seem like it's that bad. But even this beginner's climb would end up opening her eyes to the kind of thrill that she didn't realize she needed in her life. And by the way, I don't know how else to say this, but Melissa's mindset, even at that age, was very unique. In her own words, she said, quote, "I am athletic, but not competitive, and the mountains are that exact thing." And honestly, that's something that I can relate to as well. I mean, I feel like we always hear about how climbers are competing against each other, chasing records, or maybe even just competing against the mountain. But for people like Melissa, the mountains simply felt like home. She dove into the studies of mountaineering and medicine. She got certified as a wilderness first responder and an EMT. And at just 21 years old, while grinding 2 jobs to afford training and her climbing gear, Melissa was hired on as a guide for Rainier Mountain Inc., where she would lead climbs up Mount Rainier. Pardon my pun here, but Melissa's ascent into the climbing world was clearly very impressive and fantastic, but that doesn't mean that things were always easy for her. In her first month guiding climbers up mountains, Melissa was on the wrong side of so much misogyny and judgment from her male coworkers that she actually considered walking away from the work entirely. And not just her coworkers too, some male clients refused to be on her rope team simply because she was a woman. One guy apparently wouldn't stop calling her hotcakes, which, just some advice, that's probably not a nickname that's gonna get you a first date with someone. However, despite this adversity, Melissa didn't quit, and it wasn't long until she became one of the most respected mountain guides in the entire world. These frustrating experiences gave her plenty of wisdom in diffusing tense situations that certain climbers can find themselves in. You have to remember that high altitude climbing already attracts intense personalities, you can say, and on Mount Everest, letting an ego run wild can run you straight into a dangerous situation. Melissa was very good at taking on climbers with big egos, and that may be the reason why she became one of the most trusted guides on Mount Everest starting in 2008. And so if you flash forward a few years to April of 2013, Melissa found herself once again at Everest Base Camp preparing for another climbing season on the world's tallest mountain. Everyone on the mountain was a bit tense this year, and this is because of what happened the year before. You see, in 2012, a legendary New Zealand expedition operator named Russell Bryce, who was nicknamed by many people as the mayor of Everest Base Camp, well, he saw a crack growing in a massive serac high on Everest's western slope. And this was a really big deal. There were about a million reasons to worry. First of all, with average temperatures rising during typical Everest climbing seasons, the odds grew of that crack leading to, part of the serac falling and then eventually causing a fatal avalanche. And so Russell made the hardest decision of his entire career and announced to all of his 2012 clients that their expeditions were over. This is a huge deal. His clients had each paid like tens of thousands of dollars, and if you think they were getting refunds, no, that money was long gone. It had been already spent on logistics, permits, and Sherpa salaries. That's just the way that these things go. It's in the contracts that these climbers signed, but it gets worse because ultimately that serac didn't collapse in 2012, and plenty of other people still summited Mount Everest, and so it kind of seemed that Russell Bryce canceling on all of his clients was for nothing. Some people had even complained that Russell had just been overcautious. And so the question was, had he been just that? And we're going to get to that question in just a bit. And so back to 2013, the next year, everyone was kind of on high alert because of Russell Bryce's giant red flag. Sherpas were making extra sure that the routes up and down the mountain were as safe as they could possibly be, and that all fixed ropes would be placed by the time any climbers actually reached them. And so tensions were already high before the season had even really started. But when Melissa arrived at base camp, she started introducing herself to all of the climbers around her, and eventually she met 3 European men: Italian climber Simone Moreau, British climber and photographer Jonathan Griffith, and of course the leader of the expedition, Ueli Steck. Ueli was the son of a coppersmith from a part of Switzerland that's known for Swiss cheese, which I didn't know that Swiss cheese was actually from Switzerland, and so we're all learning something new today. And completely opposite to Melissa, Ueli was basically born to climb mountains. While Melissa was cleaning toilets at age 13, Ueli was already doing extreme climbs, and by the time that he had turned 17, he was already considered one of the world's top climbers. He climbed the Eiga's notorious North Face for the first time at only 18 years old, and for context, this is a Swiss Alp with a 6,000-foot face called the Mordwand, which apparently is German for murder wall, and it's killed no fewer than 64 people. Ueli climbed the murder wall many times in his career. Once he even did it in less time than it would have taken him to watch the first Avengers movie. His time was 2 hours, 22 minutes, and 50 seconds, a speed record that apparently still stands today. Now, to people like me, and most likely you, who aren't extreme technical mountaineers like this, common sense would say that speed makes climbing more dangerous, but it's interesting that the two often go hand in hand. You see, the faster that you move, the less time that you're exposed to rockfall, avalanches, and bad weather, storms, things like that. That was basically Ueli's philosophy. The press even called him the Swiss Machine, which was a nickname that he apparently hated. And sure, he was focused, relentless, efficient on the mountain. He was fast, and he took a scientific approach to training. But those who knew him best described him as warm and thoughtful. But regardless, at his peak, again, no pun intended, Ueli was both considered one of the 3 best alpine climbers in all of Europe and someone with a genuine instinct for helping others. And I have receipts for that claim, by the way. For instance, in 2008, he voluntarily climbed back up Annapurna after a week's worth of avalanches pounded the mountain, all in order to try saving a Spanish climber who had been stuck up there. And though this Spanish climber unfortunately perished, Ueli was clearly someone who wanted to be a good citizen on these mountains. He wanted to protect his fellow mountaineers. And that's exactly why it's so shocking that just a few years later, some of the best Sherpas in the world didn't just consider him to be a villain, but literally dead meat. And the decision that turned Ueli into a target seems so minor that most people would never imagine it could start a fight, let alone leave someone's life hanging in the balance. Folks, things are about to get very dark, and so before they do, I want to lighten the mood for just a moment and tell you about Drink Element. Element is the sponsor of this video, and they just made a huge move that I'm so excited to tell you guys about. So if you ever reached for like a giant coffee or an energy drink because you're kind of dragging, only to feel wired for an hour and then exhausted later, well, Element just came out with a new option that makes a lot more sense. This is their lemonade iced tea. It has 50 milligrams of caffeine from full spectrum black tea extract, which is not isolated caffeine, by the way, along with Element's usual electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And because the caffeine comes from tea, it also naturally comes with L-theanine and polyphenols, which gives you a noticeably steadier feeling, less spike, less drop. And unlike a lot of caffeinated drinks, Element's lemonade iced tea has no sugar, no artificial colors, and none of the other dodgy ingredients. I think it's a really good option for like a midday pick-me-up or a long drive, or of course before heading out on trail or doing some sort of exercise when you know you're gonna be sweating. And right now, Element is offering my viewers a free 8-count sample pack of their most popular drink mix flavors with any order. That's 8 single serving packets free with any Element order. And so I would go out and order yourself some lemonade iced tea through drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking and get that free Element sample pack as well. This deal is only available through my link, and so you must go to drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking or click that link in the description. Ueli arrived at Everest Base Camp with Simone and Jonathan. Now, they were there to attempt a new route on the West Ridge, and they were going to try to do this without supplemental oxygen. They were climbing independently without Sherpa support, which was allowed, but of course, that's really only advised for like the world's best climbers. And at the same time, Melissa Arnot would be guiding her clients up the standard route of Mount Everest. Now, something incredible about Melissa is that she has summited Everest 6 times to my knowledge, and in comparison, I can barely get myself to go to the gym 6 times a month or whatever. And even more than that, Melissa was making impacts across Nepal that were truly heroic. You see, in 2010, Melissa was climbing the 23,390-foot Barunsi in Nepal with Chuang Nima Sherpa, a legend in the community with 19 Everest summits, a man known for being funny, kind, and impossibly strong, someone that Melissa considered a good friend. Chuang Nima was fixing the ropes on the summit ridge when the cornice beneath him suddenly collapsed, and sadly, there was no safety net for him, and not for his family either in the wake of his death. Melissa met with the famed Sherpa's widow in her home after the tragedy, and she made the decision to support his family out of her own pocket for as long as she had the money to do so. And then 2 years after making this commitment, Melissa co-founded the Juniper Fund, which is a nonprofit providing financial support and vocational training to the families of Nepalese mountain workers that are killed on the job, which is incredible. I mean, records and accolades are great, but this is the kind of thing that like actually matters, the kind of thing that truly affects people's lives for the better. And so this is just one example of what made Melissa such a beloved figure in the Everest community, not only among the climbers, but also among the Sherpas. Melissa and Ueli met in the early days of Everest's 2013 season. Melissa actually learned that Ueli had summited Everest for the first time in 2012, and she was impressed by his pedigree. Melissa assumed that once the actual climbing began, she wouldn't be seeing much of Ueli and his team. I mean, Ueli, Simone, and Jonathan were going to be establishing a brand new route up the West Ridge. They were going to be moving quickly, and they were going to be away from many of like the usual places that climbers go, the usual routes. And so it was a fair assumption, but then again, assuming anything on Mount Everest proves time and time again to be a mistake. And for Ueli and his team, it was about to prove to be a fatal one. Now, I know that none of this like seems connected yet. I know it's kind of murky here, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Melissa was guiding her clients like any other year. Ueli was chasing one of the boldest climbs of his life, and the Sherpas were just trying to make sure that the mountain was safe under the shadow of a hanging serac. But in a few days' time, all three of these routes and situations and groups of people were going to collide on the mountain, and it was going to have some very insane results. Around 8 a.m. on April 27th, 2013, the three European men, led by Ueli, left Camp 2 to climb the Lhotse face and acclimatize at Camp 3, right around 23,600 feet in altitude. Now, at the same time, a team of Sherpas was fixing ropes on the Lhotse face that very same morning. And you need to know that this is hard, dangerous work. I mean, they're preparing the route for the commercial expeditions to follow, and it's a job that the Sherpas almost always do alone on the mountain. Like, they go up there first before the paying clients and the guides and all those people, and they set the ropes, they make sure everything's good. They do it in a way that's uninterrupted by the Westerners and the other people that are trying to climb to the summit. And then once they're finished, the season can basically start. Now, while the Sherpas were doing this work, the three Europeans were climbing about 50 yards away from them, again, on their own independent line, and they were trying their best to stay out of the way. Once again, they understood how this worked. They knew that the Sherpas were doing dangerous, difficult work. They knew they probably should try their best not to interrupt them. However, even though they were trying their best to stay out of the way, at one point, they had to cross the Sherpas' fixed lines at a belay station just below Camp 3. And that's when the shouting started. The Sherpas claim that they asked the Europeans to stop but were ignored, and that the three Europeans kicked ice onto them, a claim which the Europeans flat out deny, by the way. Obviously, accounts differ. The Europeans would go on to blame the Sherpas' wounded pride. The Sherpas would blame the Europeans' disrespect for their work, but in the end, ice axes were getting pointed at people, the Nepalese word for motherfucker was getting thrown around, and finally, the Sherpa team descended the Lhotse face back to Camp 2 without finishing the day's work. Meanwhile, the three Europeans felt, well, not exactly guilty. They maintained that they were not to blame, but they did feel bad that they had indirectly interrupted the Sherpas' rope fixing job, and so they did the rest of the day's work for the Sherpas, a gesture which did not necessarily go over very well. Now, you might be thinking like, okay, maybe the Europeans acted a little out of line, or maybe the Sherpas did, but like, this doesn't really sound like a big deal, and I get that. However, you need to know that this particular conflict was kind of just a boiling point for a much larger issue, something that had been going on for years. Resentment had been building among the Sherpas, who were deeply frustrated over exploitation by the Nepalese government and poor treatment on behalf of Westerners. And so both sides of this story had a very real argument to make about what happened that day, but it didn't seem like the Sherpas were in the mood for a debate or a conversation even with these three Europeans. Melissa Arnot just so happened to be in camp at the exact moment that a huge angry mob of Sherpas formed. They were back at Camp 2 by this point, and again, Melissa was friends to the Sherpas. She was someone who knew what it felt like to be exploited by clients. She was someone who had treated Sherpas' injuries and someone who was there for Sherpas' families during the worst of times. She was someone that the Sherpas respected, and she also knew that when Sherpas get angry, they don't always use words. They would sometimes get aggressive. Melissa burst into Ueli's tent and she warned the 3 European climbers that they were in very real danger. But unfortunately, despite this warning, there wasn't really enough time to do, well, anything. The Sherpas surrounded Ueli's tent, and not only were they red hot, but they were armed with rocks and crampons. And so as soon as Ueli and his team emerged from the tent, the Sherpas closed in on them. Ueli quickly took a rock to the head and started bleeding, while Simone and Jonathan were kicked and punched. It was total chaos, and honestly, it felt like an angry mob that was about to just have their way with someone who had been sentenced to death. But Melissa was not going to let that happen, not on her watch. And so she tried to position herself between the angry Sherpas and the 3 climbers, almost acting as like a physical shield, right? She begged the Sherpas to stop, speaking both English and Nepalese, trying to de-escalate the situation. And I just gotta say, this was incredibly brave, even heroic on her part, literally putting her body on the line to try to prevent the worst case scenario from happening. And not only was it extremely brave, but it was also extremely smart, because Melissa knew that the Sherpas likely wouldn't want to hurt a woman. And so Melissa shuffled Ueli into the tent for his own safety, but then the Sherpas put Simone on his knees and made him apologize for things that he had said up on the mountain. But that still didn't prevent one of the Sherpas from slapping him across the face. I promise you I'm not making this up. I mean, you couldn't even write this. It's literally like out of a movie or something. More rocks were thrown, holes were torn in the tent, but eventually a deal was brokered by Melissa between the Europeans and the Sherpas. Ueli, Simone, and Jonathan were given 1 hour to leave Mount Everest for good, or else. That is truly an insane deal, and to me, it shows just how angry the Sherpas really were. I mean, think about it. Under the stress of last season's revelation by Russell Bryce, the Sherpas were probably feeling extreme pressure to make sure that their work was done perfectly this year. And any threats to that would not only mean threats to their own livelihoods, but also to the lives of the hundreds of clients who were trusting the Sherpas to make the mountain as safe as possible when they eventually start climbing it. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I know the whole story. There's definitely maybe something more that the Europeans did or said that contributed to the anger of the Sherpas. I really don't know. This is just what's been reported. There's always 2 sides to a story, but based on everything that I've read, it seems like it was just the wrong place and the wrong time for Ueli and his team to be trying to skirt around the Sherpas. And the fact that they didn't even get the opportunity to summit Everest and were basically run out of camp like that, well, that shows how seriously the Sherpas were taking this offense. And so the European climbers left the mountain, and on paper, this should have been the end of things, right? But of course, I mean, we know that drama like this never ends that smoothly. Now, fortunately, despite everyone's stress and despite all of this chaos on the mountain, the 2013 climbing season ended with no major avalanches. Climbers went home, the mountain emptied out, and Melissa went back to her life in the United States, and Ueli went back to Switzerland trying to process what the hell had just happened to him and his climbing partners. But despite this confusion and probably a lot of anger, Ueli was still very desperate to return to Mount Everest one day. He was not giving up. But of course, as we all know, Everest for many people is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But we'll come back to that shortly. On paper, things were done. Ueli was alive. Melissa had prevented a murder, essentially, or multiple murders. And the Sherpas had very clearly sent their message. However, in reality, 2013 was only the beginning. For Ueli, Everest became unfinished business, tempting him to return each climbing season for almost 4 years. And for the Sherpas, the danger that they had been screaming about was about to become horrifyingly real. So do you remember Russell Bryce's warning and his dramatic cancellation of his client's expeditions a few years earlier? Well, on April 18th, 2014, just 1 year after the Sherpa mob and the fight, well, that exact hanging serac that Russell had warned everyone about broke off Everest's western shoulder. The ice that fell was the size of an NBA basketball court, like 113 feet thick, weighing over 1,400 tons. And when it hit the Khumbu icefall traveling at terminal velocity, it didn't make a sound that most people at base camp could hear, but what they did hear were the screams afterwards. 16 Sherpas were killed in that avalanche. 3 of their bodies were never found at all. They're still up there somewhere in the ice, presumably. 9 others sustained blunt trauma injuries severe enough to require evacuation. And here's what you need to know. The Sherpas who died that morning were doing exactly what Sherpas do every single season. They were fixing ropes, they were establishing the route, carrying loads, they were making Everest possible for all of the paying clients that were to come. This was exactly the kind of fear that the Sherpas in 2013 were carrying. They knew how dangerous Everest was, even for just a day, and on this 2014 day, their worst fears were confirmed. Among the deceased Sherpas was Aang Kaji Sherpa, a veteran of over half a dozen Everest expeditions, the father of 6 children. In fact, in 2012, just a few years earlier, he had been the first person to summit Everest in that entire season, putting up the climbing ropes for everyone else that followed him. When he came down from the summit, he was greeted with enormous applause, and yet he remained humble and smiling, downplaying what he had just accomplished. And now he was gone, dead at 41 years old. And his story is just one of the 16 Sherpas who died. This was the worst single day in Everest history up until that point, even worse than the 1996 disaster. Melissa Arnot, who was at Everest Base Camp when this happened, preparing for another season of guiding clients up the mountain, well, she grabbed her medical gear and basically ran up the mountain to try and help however she could. But sadly, there was just nothing that could be done at this point. It was just a horrible, horrible day for everyone involved. The scale of the loss for the Sherpas and for the climbing community is hard to even put into words. And so often, it's the Sherpas whose lives and deaths don't get the kind of press and attention that the paying clients or the professional climbers do. That's something I've seen a lot of you actually mention in the comments, and so I really wanted to make that point clear. And so a few days after the disaster, the Sherpas announced that they would not work on Everest for the rest of the 2014 season out of respect for the 16 Sherpas who died. And to me, I feel like part of it was also sort of a protest, especially having been put through so many emotions over the past few climbing seasons. Now, that's me editorializing there. I could be wrong, but it kind of feels like that. Now, 2014 was an entirely different year for Ueli Steck. Just 6 months after being run off Everest, in late 2013, Ueli traveled to Annapurna, which is the world's 10th highest peak, and arguably its deadliest. There's even a saying about Annapurna among climbers that it's dangerous from the north, dangerous and difficult from the northwest, and steep, dangerous, and difficult from the south. And after hearing that saying, take a guess at which route Ueli was interested in. Ueli and Annapurna's south face had some history, you could say. He had actually taken a falling rock to the head back in 2007, tumbled a few thousand feet down the mountain, and then been found wandering disoriented on a glacier below. Crazy. Then in 2008, a fellow climber died of a stroke on the ascent, and Ueli had to bury him in a crevasse. And now, in 2013, his climbing partner had pulled out due to visible risks on the south face, and so Ueli decided to make the ascent all alone. Ueli summited Annapurna in the dark without any oxygen, only realizing that he had made it to the top when there was literally nothing left for him to climb. He only stayed there for 5 minutes before turning around and starting back down the south face, and he didn't even take any pictures because he'd lost his camera in an avalanche on the way up, which had only temporarily slowed him down, by the way. From base camp to base camp, this feat only took him 28 hours, which is another monumental speed record. I mean, he literally could have just watched Avengers 11.5 times in a row instead. And by the way, I promise this video isn't sponsored by Marvel. Now, because Ueli hadn't taken a summit photo and never turned on his GPS watch during the climb, some people questioned whether he'd actually summited or not. But then in March of 2014, the jury of the Piolet d'Or, basically the Academy Awards of Mountaineering, you could say, well, they had to make a decision. Would they honor an ascent with no photographic or GPS evidence, or would they throw it out? And honestly, the cool thing about climbing culture, one of the many cool things I should say, is that they have this long-standing tradition of trust. You basically take climbers at their word, assuming there's no obvious evidence that they're lying. And you do this because there's this shared understanding that honor matters. And so Ueli's word was enough for 2 Sherpas lower on the mountain. It was enough for 2 other climbers who made a similar ascent weeks later. It was enough for Elizabeth Hawley, the legendary, notoriously skeptical chronicler of Himalayan climbs. And honestly, it's enough for me. And so Ueli won his second Piolet d'Or, which I'm definitely butchering the pronunciation of, by the way, I'm sorry, but it's basically the golden ice axe, mountaineering's highest honor, if you will. And later he would admit that he had probably taken too much risk on that climb of Annapurna. He said that mixing that kind of route with his style of climbing should really just be like a once in a lifetime thing because, well, the math's not that complicated. Try it a few more times and you're probably gonna die. And so Ueli had gotten lucky once again. Annapurna proved that Ueli could still do the impossible, but it did not resolve his temptation to return to Mount Everest. The trauma of the 2014 season on Mount Everest would be compounded by another catastrophe the following year in 2015, when a massive earthquake triggered avalanches that killed 19 people at Everest Base Camp and basically shut down the mountain for weeks. And that year, Ueli employed several Sherpas to accompany him on other climbs around Nepal, but he didn't go back to Mount Everest. Not yet. And as for Melissa Arnot's relationship with Everest, well, she also had some unfinished business with the mountain. In 2016, after 3 previous attempts and 7 years of trying, Melissa would summit Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen and survive the descent, by the way, becoming the first American woman to ever do this. This was her 6th Everest summit, the most of any Western woman. It was also her last ever season on the mountain. Ueli spent 2016 in Tibet, but just like the previous year, he was only climbing various mountains around Mount Everest, not Everest itself. It just seemed like he still had unfinished business on the world's tallest mountain, and maybe, just maybe, he was still feeling a little traumatized about what had happened up there in 2013, but I don't know that for sure. If it were me, I probably would. But the following year, in 2017, Ueli would try to finally put the past behind him, and he would finally try to climb Mount Everest once again, this time without the protection of his previous savior, Melissa. And so on April 16th, 2017, Ueli arrived at Everest Base Camp with a plan. He wanted to traverse not only Everest, but also Lhotse, the world's first and 4th highest mountains together, and he wanted to do it without supplemental oxygen while taking the treacherous West Ridge route that he had attempted back in 2013. By this point, the West Ridge route had only been climbed like a handful of times, and no one had ever successfully done Everest to Lhotse on 0 oxygen in one continuous push. This was, in short, extremely ambitious, even for an elite climber like Ueli. On April 29th, he ascended from base camp to Camp 2, right around 21,000 feet, the same place where he had nearly been killed by the mob of Sherpas a few years earlier. Now, the plan for the next day was to climb up the traditional Everest route to the South Col at about 26,000 feet, and then descend back to Camp 2. The purpose of this was to acclimatize. But that evening, while he was at Camp 2, Ueli looked across at Nuptse, the 3rd peak in the Everest Lhotse horseshoe. The conditions up there apparently looked pretty pristine. And so Ueli texted his climbing partner, Tenji Sherpa, who was out of commission due to frostbite, by the way. He texted that he was changing his plans and that Nuptse was now the new goal. And one thing about Mount Everest and the Himalayas is that if you're gonna change your plans, you better do so assuming every single risk associated with it. The next morning, right around 4:30 a.m., Ueli began climbing in the pitch black dark. He started the day climbing with a French man named Yannick Graziani, but eventually the two of them split up. Yannick continued toward Camp 3 on Mount Everest, and of course, Ueli turned towards Nuptse. And as for Ueli, he was climbing the way he always did. Fast, light, and just very, very nimble. At approximately 9 a.m., climbing alone at around 25,000 feet on Nuptse, Ueli, for the first time in this entire story really, got really unlucky. And the harsh truth is that even just one stroke of bad luck is all Everest needs to create a tragedy. Now, the exact cause will never be known. No one was with him. No one saw what happened. All we know is that Ueli Steck fell over 3,000 feet to his death. His remains were recovered from the Western Coombe between Camps 1 and 2. It's just incredible because Ueli survived all of those other death-defying climbs and survived that violent clash with an angry mob of Sherpas. And yet, here he was at 40 years old, and his time climbing and his time on Earth was over. Ueli's death makes the 2013 drama and fight feel even stranger in hindsight, at least to me. And I say that because Ueli, one of the men that Melissa helped save on Mount Everest, eventually came back to that same mountain, and this time, well, no one was there to step between him and the consequences. Melissa, on the other hand, well, she never returned to Mount Everest, now having a very clear understanding of who pays the highest price up there. And through the Juniper Fund, her work continued to support the families of the workers who make Everest possible, helping with funding essential safety, rescue, and medical training for the local Nepal high-altitude workforce. And in 2025, she even released a book called Enough, which is a biography detailing her years on Everest. Ueli Steck was cremated at a monastery in Nepal in clear view of the Himalayan peaks where he died. And his climbing partners would eventually go on to scatter his ashes in Nepal and Switzerland across all of the mountains that he loved. Folks, I know this story is a little bit scattered, but ultimately, I think it comes down to the fact that this is a story about the choices that people make on Mount Everest. Melissa Arnot chose to help dozens of Sherpas' families in the wake of tragedy. She also chose to help Ueli, Simone, and Jonathan negotiate with the Sherpas that she had grown to respect so much. Russell Bryce chose to cut his season short for fear of tragedy. The Sherpas collectively chose to cut their season short as a response to a different tragedy. And Ueli made many choices across his climbing career, including on Annapurna, on the Lhotse face, and on Nuptse. Some of these choices led to glory, and one of them led to the worst case scenario. It's clear that Ueli tested his luck one too many times. He would probably admit that if he was still here, even if he did have the skill to defy logic over and over. However, to me, the one choice that still remains controversial is the choice that Ueli made in 2013, as well as the choice that the Sherpas made that same year. I mean, if Ueli and his team hadn't crossed the Sherpas' fixed lines without permission, if he hadn't tried to do their jobs after the Sherpas essentially abandoned their post, if he was able to complete his second Everest summit, well, would he have ever been tempted to climb Everest again in 2017? Would this have ultimately saved his life? Oh, and as for the Sherpas, if they had chosen to react a little bit differently to Ueli and his team, if they had chosen to forgive Ueli and allow him to continue up the mountain, would they also have inadvertently saved his life by changing the course of the future? Of course, all of that is hindsight, but Everest just makes you think that way because at the moment, from 23,000 feet up all the way through the death zone, It's hard to see what's right in front of you and make good choices every single time. And again, all Everest needs is one bad choice to make it your final mountain. Folks, please join me in making a donation to the Juniper Fund. I've got it linked down below. And if this was your first time watching me, I really hope that I earned your subscription. Thank you so much for watching. And if you liked this video, YouTube seems to think you'll enjoy this one next. And so give it a click, and I'll see all of you over there.